Zora was a novelist, a poet, a dramatist, an essayist, a folklorist, an anthropologist, and arguably the most significant collector and interpreter of Southern African American culture.
She was a philosopher. She was a fierce, feminist, and a feminist thinker, and practitioner. She lived life not bounded by the limitations that folk tried to place on her in terms of her gender and in terms of her race, even though it doesn't mean that she wasn't impacted, right? Of course she was.
I think Hurston was interested in the things that unite us culturally. I mean, she was a fiction writer and she was a storyteller and she privileged story, but she was also a social scientist who was really serious as an anthropologist and serious about the connections among Black people throughout the diaspora. Because Hurston grew up in an all Black community, it was like a four-walled room where there was safety and freedom from the white gaze.
Her family moved to Eatonville, and that's where she was raised, but she considers that her hometown. And so much so that many people have always assumed, some people even assume that she was born there, but she wasn't. But I think Eatonville played a big role in who she became later, because as an anthropologist, a novelist, a scholar in many ways, a poet, a lot of her work always centered Black life. She was not necessarily someone who was as pivotal in particular things of what Black folks should or shouldn't do, but she always was someone who observed and engaged with Black life. She was always curious about Black people, the way they discuss things, their music, their culture. And when she traveled through the South, but also the Caribbean, a lot of what she did collect, she did stop in Eatonville and she collected songs and narratives. So she was always pivotal in that idea. And I think coming from and being raised in a historically Black town where you're allowed to really immerse yourself in various forms of Blackness in one space, I would say could have a big influence on how someone would see themselves in their work.
Yeah, I think because she grew up in such a specific Black community, where she observed very deeply and organically Black folkways. She just observed them as a child and breathed them in. They were organic to her life. They were in the air. So she breathed in those Black folkways. And then as she began to study anthropology, she realized that that was a thing, that there were continuities among Black people, not only across the country, but globally. And I think the specificity of her experience in Eatonville just helped her to connect with those Black folkways, and then when she saw them echoed in other communities, especially other communities across the diaspora, she became interested in studying those things more formally.
Eatonville literally shows up, right, as a character in her novels and in her folklore and in her collecting. But the formalization of her ability to wed her studies, right, her studies in anthropology and in ethnographic collection and so on, to then use that to give the lie to the distortions and misrepresentations of Black people that are being promulgated everywhere, I think is what makes her such a sort of radical and important figure of the time, because what she was saying was, these folk, these Black working class folk, they're speaking the stuff of poetry, right?
I believe Zora Neale Hurston was interdisciplinary before being interdisciplinary, and having different skills and different ways of looking at life and things was a considered a necessity. She was doing things now that I think some scholars are still working up the courage to do. She looked at, when we talk about the global South and the South being more than just the US, but looking at the larger global South, she was doing these things way light years ahead when she was drawing connections between Black Southerners and Black Caribbean folk. She was someone who I think, because she centered not necessarily larger systems, but the lived experience of Black people is what makes her work and her ability to do so many different things and engage with Black folks in so many different ways, because there's no one way to look at Black life.
Zora wrote books about who we were as a people when white people weren't looking. She wrote about what she called the Negro farthest down, regular self-educated Black folks who were in the midst of living their lives without much regard to white people and what they were doing. She also wrote about the internal lives of Black women. Their eyes were watching God privileges the internal life of a self-educated Black woman who is on a journey to know herself. That seems, obvious now because we've read The Color Purple and we've read Sula and we've read, we've read all the novelists, all the Black women novelists who've come after Hurston. But for Hurston to privilege the internal life of a Black woman in a book that was published in 1937, that was extraordinary. That was revolutionary. And so she was really so much ahead of her time, when she was writing, that sometimes people couldn't quite get to what she was doing.